All right. So I'm going to pick up where I left off with Howl. So part two. So here he's kind of asking the question of like who is to blame for this robbery of potential, and he lands on Moloch, right, which is the god of child sacrifice, which I think is kind of an interesting metaphor to explore. Because obviously it's this extended metaphor for the sacrifice of potential, of innocence, of the future, of hope, right? So the idea of like the child representing all of these things, because if we think about like what acts as kind of a metaphor for possibility and optimism and innocence, a child kind of represents all of those things. So to kind of attribute all of this to Moloch is sort of the idea of like sacrificing the metaphorical child. Um, and so, obviously there's a lot of kind of stream of consciousness, sort of, it's almost like a rant. This section is really kind of like a drunken or drug fueled rant. But essentially what happens in this section is that Moloch becomes a representative of something bigger, right? It's this entity that is to blame for all of the bad in the world. It is the force that kills creativity and authenticity and idealism. All right, and then we get to the third part, which is the part about Carl Solomon, who was, the fellow writer. And this is kind of an imagined version of something that really happened, which is them meeting in a mental institution. So it's, he's repeating over and over, I'm with you in Rockland, I'm with you in Rockland. Again, it could be seen as sort of like hypnotic, right? So potentially kind of mirroring one of the sorts of treatments that was used at the time. It's also kind of, it has like a ranty effect as well. All right, so the first reference, Carl Solomon imitating the shade of my mother, a reference to the fact that Allen Ginsberg's mother had mental issues and was kind of in and out of institutions for his whole life. So it's kind of suggesting this idea that Solomon was mimicking her. In other words, acting crazy. And then these other references like, murdering your 12 secretaries, they're likely not like literal. They're more just like cliched images of lunacy to show us like how kind of far gone he saw Carl Solomon as being. And then when he talks about, we are great writers on the same dreadful typewriter, I think this kind of speaks to the gist of the poem, right? So the dreadful typewriter becomes this metaphor for the world they live in, and these stories that they're tasked with telling, so basically what it means to be a writer or an artist in America. Later, when he talks about the faculties of the skull no longer admit the worms of the senses, it's almost like a defining the idea of like losing touch with reality, where your physical experience and your mental experience can no longer really be reconciled, when you can't really trust your own impressions of the world. And then he talks about like the futility of like shock treatments. He talks about like the being in a straitjacket. Let's see, where is the? So hard to find things when he just repeats himself. Oh, here it is. Okay, where 50 more shocks will never return your soul to its body again. From its pilgrimage to cross a void. So, basically the futility of shock treatment. It robs patients of parts of their soul, but doesn't restore sanity, right? So, one of the reasons that, people are often so critical of shock treatments is because it, it makes people like more docile, right? So it takes a part of them away, but it doesn't necessarily really fix the problem. Okay, and then when he talks about hugging and kissing the United States under our bed sheets, the United states that coughs all night and won't let us sleep. Um, so just reiterating the idea that they're victims of the country they live in, right? The sickness of the country is what did this to them, is what led them to this madness. And this is continued with this reference here to the national anthem, but it's in this like stream of consciousness way. Oh, starry spangled shock of mercy, the eternal war is here. So it goes from this allusion to the Star Spangled Banner into like the shock of mercy, which is basically a reference to shock treatment. You know, it's the shock of oblivion, right? Temporary shock of oblivion, and then return to the reality, which would be like the eternal war. Then this part when he says, where is it? Oh, victory, forget your underwear, we're free. So again, this kind of harkens back to that, like, you know, quote unquote madman, like running naked. And we're left wondering, like, free from what? Is it freedom in death? Is it freedom to the liberation of insanity? Are they free from the institution? Are they no longer subject to the constraints or expectations of society? It's hard to say. And then this last image, you know, the journey on the highway across America in tears to the door of my cottage. I think that this has to do with like the simpler times of America and like American values. But I want to actually touch on that when we talk about a supermarket in California, because I think that both poems end kind of on the same note, but I think that it's a little bit easier to interpret in a supermarket in California. So we'll save that for when we discuss that one.